55, Peggy was born.
Yeah.
She was born in this house.
Yep,
Okay.
That's right. John we already had John in Water Gap, and matter of fact, one time we left him on vacation, we were going out on vacation, and from the Water Gap house, and we left John in a basket on the couch in the living room, and I was backing the car out, and my next door neighbor said, "Didn't you forget something?" He shouted at me. Floyd Howard, that was his name, Floyd Howard. And, oh yes, I forgot. We're about to leave. I don't know how far we would have gotten.
Well,
That's always a family joke.
We started to talk about your law career, but haven't gotten to it yet.
Oh, that's right.
Before we do, since we're talking about Water Gap, you have a strong connection to that church down there.
Oh, the Church of the Mountain.
Start?
That started when I was in Water Gap in the house that I finished describing, and off of 611 down there. And that started partly because of this terrace that I just described to you. Because I was away from the house one day, Jean was on the terrace, it was used, and it was another hot day, and she was sunbathing. Well, I described to you that the U-shaped structure that protects you from both sides, and the road side of the house, the front door of the house, she was there sunbathing on a couch or something, a lounge chair, and suddenly somebody was ringing the doorbell, and she hadn't heard the doorbell, and then a man came around from the back of the house, and it was Hubert Newton, the new pastor at Delaware Water Gap Church of the Mountain. Mm-hmm. And he said, he backed away. He says, I'll step out of sight, but I'll call to you. I was just looking for Alex Bensinger, and I don't want to disturb your privacy. Well, he was all flustered, of course. Wonderful guy. And anyway, to make a longer story short, he convinced me that I should start coming to the Church of the Mountain. I'd been a Presbyterian at East Stroudsburg, but I wasn't attending at all for various reasons. But so finally he had convinced me at a later time. I wasn't there the day that all this happened. And I joined the church choir, and he sang in the church choir. He sang tenor. And I so enjoyed worshiping there with your family and the John Wilsons, and of course I was pretty soon working with John Wilson's father at the YMCA, and that's another story. His name was John Wilson also. He was executive director. But the Water Gap experience was neat, and we had good times. We had good friends and neighbors, and like Edna Broadhead and the Howards, and I formed an attachment to that church, and I'm still worshiping there and still singing in the choir.
So you're the longest lived.
52 years later or something, 53 years later.
You've been in that choir longer than anybody.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Marion Drake is pretty long.
Oh, yeah.
You've got to check on Marion.
Yeah.
She hung in there for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm still hanging in, and I should retire soon. But I really enjoy singing and worshiping. We had some marvelous, interesting, some not so good, but some very good. Hubert Newton was excellent, and he was a real recruiter too, and he had one hand. And did you meet him when he was back here?
Never.
Last summer or the summer before?
No, I didn't meet him.
Oh, of course, he's very close friends with Jean and John, and they'd remained in contact. He'd gone to the West Coast, back where he was originated from, either Portland or either Oregon or Washington, I forget which. And he had lost his hand in an industrial accident before he turned to the ministry. and then had gone to and studied for the ministry and became a Presbyterian pastor. And somehow, I forget how he got to Water Gap at the other end of the country practically. But he was the first pastor I remember, because he convinced me to come to church. And anyway, interesting story about him. That as I said, he'd preach and he'd then come sing in the choir. And he was a tenor. He had a good tenor voice, and children, and a nice wife. Although she didn't sing in the choir. And then we had a series of pastors, and one of them was not too long after he left. Was Markin, Hubert Markin. Oh, what's Markin's first name? I forget. And I thought I'd never forget him, but I remember his last name. And he was a retired, semi-retired pastor, and he was not a great pastor, but he was an excellent preacher. He preached very interesting and sometimes funny, and not entertaining is not the right word, but he kept your attention. Mm-hmm. He had a tremendous sense of humor, so much so that he wrote a regular weekly column in the Pocono Record called Markin Time. And he had all these quotes, and he was really fun to have, and he'd make a lot of mistakes. For instance, when we do responsive readings, he would get mixed up between the large bold type and the other type, but we got so used to it was just no problem. We'd switch right over and we'd do his part, and he'd do our part, and everybody thought that was okay at this point. Then we were totally without a pastor, and we had 5 college professors. I think it was 5, and some of them I still know and see once in a while. One was a Lutheran pastor, part-time, church out in the West End, a big, tall, rangy Dutchman, and he was a pastor. And then we had Jim Lighting at East Stroudsburg University. You know Jim, probably.
I do, yes.
Yeah, and he was excellent. He actually organized this group. And now they didn't do any pastoral work for the church. They just preached. That's all. Mm-hmm. And and then Bill Hine, who was a vice president of the university some years ago, a very smart guy. He had actually studied for a while for the ministry. Bill Hine had. So he never became a minister. He'd gone into education instead. And we had a part-time from the Episcopal Church too. So and he's a very scholarly man, and we had an excellent, and Lighting himself preached, and Lighting has a lot of experience too, and so we had an excellent service. And then there was Ken Matthews, who died, and he had a guitar, and he had sort of long hair, I think, but a nice-looking man, and he and his wife, and he had a family, and they lived in the manse down at the bottom of the hill. Mm-hmm. But the guys like Luther Markin, he had a home out in the West End, out in Snydersville someplace. His wife was a local native here. He had died or retired totally. I don't remember why he stopped preaching anymore. But then we had another family in the manse with children, and they sang in the choir, some of them. And he went out to Thailand, I think. He was a missionary, and we had, and then Dale Dealtree, our first lady pastor, she was there briefly. And then the lady from Pottsville, I can't remember her name, but she didn't do any pastoral work or did very little. And at this point, our congregation, the whole church, was going down, down, down. And we were just struggling. And I don't know whether it was partly because of the choir, because like Fred Waring and his wife came to church, I think, once or twice. And frankly, our choir was so awful that he said he was never coming back again. Uh-huh. So that's how bad. But then we had some good service too, because Fred Waring's choral youth groups who came up to train, I forget what they called them.
Over at the Castle Inn.
Over at the Castle Inn, they'd train and they'd come over and do a couple of numbers for our service. They'd sing from up on the balcony, and it was terrific. I mean, it was just marvelous music that we had. So I was clerk of session for a while. I was a poor minute taker. I don't know why. My handwriting's always been pretty bad anyway. And but at that time, as we went downhill so fast, and we're doing a study, and Presbyterian was trying to help us with a study, and we're talking about a merger with the Methodist Church across the street. And it would have been a full merger, and our church would have been closed. And I talked to a lot of people, prominent Presbyterians who shall be nameless, very prominent one in Stroudsburg, and he said, you got to close. You know, he had heard all the facts too. He'd been on the Presbyterian boards and stuff, and knew the story. And so go ahead. We negotiated then with the Methodist Church and came to a conclusion. We got permission from Presbytery and the Synod and our hierarchy that we needed to get approval on, and the Methodists were doing the same sort of thing through their organization. They're much more structured than we are up above, and much more restricted and limited. And their bishop said no, he wouldn't approve it. And so we got Karen Nichols, and things turned around totally, and went in the other direction. Their congregation went way down, and ours started to grow immensely. The last 16 years, 18 years, Karen? It's
something like that.
Yeah, and here we are thriving, and the other church is closed. It was the saddest worship service I think I ever attended, except maybe when my first wife died. My first wife was a Catholic, but anyway, we marched over there in a procession, and after having a service in our church, and had a sort of a service. I forget what the type of service is. It's a desanctifying of that church, and there was formal procedures we went through. We had a joint service. We had a series over the period of years, 2 joint services with the Methodists each year, where we would go to their church one year for the Maundy Thursday before
Easter. It's before Easter, you're saying?
One's before Easter and one's before Thanksgiving.
Oh.
I forget what it is, or maybe it isn't before Thanksgiving, but it's right around Thanksgiving, so that we'd take turns. We'd have a joint service in our. This was before the decline of really both churches, but they didn't decline at the same time we did, you see. And they declined so far that they couldn't maintain it anymore. And that's why it was done that way. But I think the Church of the Mountain is such a terrific institution, and not only an institution, but a spiritual place to worship, and it's just going great guns. It's just exciting to be part of it, and it's helped me through a lot of times.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe now we should get back to your law.
Okay, the law.
Now, well, I know you have a lot of. I don't know. Can somebody ask a question, and is it a viable question to say, tell us about your law career?
Sure.
Because you've done so many things. You've got a lot of awards, and you've.
Yeah, well, not a lot of them were for law. Were for public service. Basically, I got a bunch of awards, but I am interested in the law, and I enjoy it, and I'm still practicing law after 50 some years, and this has been fun. I got on the board of the bar. The bar existed when I was first admitted. I guess there were 18 or 20 lawyers. Maybe there were 22. Now there's 260 or something like that as members of our bar association, and virtually all of them are members of our bar association. And there were some fine lawyers. My dad, of course, was practicing there. My brother, and another lawyer named C. Edward Depew was practicing at the time, although he was about to form a partnership with. He was an associate. He wasn't in partnership with my dad. He formed with another lawyer named Detlef Hansen, whose son, Philip, oldest son, became my son-in-law because he married my oldest daughter, Diane. Uh-huh. And but anyway, Depew taught me a lot, and of course my dad did, and my brother Chud had been practicing, and Depew left the office and went with Hansen, and I came in so that the two boys and their father were formed a partnership and practiced together. I was an associate for a time, but very quickly my dad took us in because my dad got sick, and he had a stroke in 1952. And it was a bad stroke. He struggled for a while and had another stroke, and he was totally paralyzed. And then he died with a stroke in '54. And then my brother and I continued on as a partnership. And but at that time we were on 7th Street at 10. It was either 10 or 14 North 7th Street, and we had this is an old building. The history of the firm was that A. Mitchell Palmer, as a young attorney, lived in Stroudsburg. In 1885, became associated with John B. Storm, who was a retired judge practicing law at that address and owned that building. It's now a travel agency. Alice's Travel Agency is in there. And it's right halfway between two banks, and on both sides of the street there was the Stroudsburg National Bank with a town clock on it, and the Security Bank and Trust Company was in the red brick building. And anyway, it was real handy to the courthouse because it was halfway between both of those. And my dad was deeply involved with the bank and doing their legal work, as was Palmer before him. Palmer, anyway, became Attorney General under Woodrow Wilson, and had his Attorney General office in Washington, and he had a private law practice in Washington, and he had a private law practice in Stroudsburg, all at the same time. And apparently that was legal in those days, and being Attorney General wasn't a full-time job, which sounds strange. But in any event, Palmer was very articulate. He'd been a chairman of the Democratic Committee of Pennsylvania, and a congressman, and he moved the nomination of Woodrow Wilson on his first term, and you know that story of it. He was good to my dad, and my dad inherited some marvelous clients from Palmer, and Palmer became ill and died in the 30s, and my dad bought out the building and the practice from the Palmer estate, and Dad used to go around singing in the barbershop, Lackawanna Quartet they called it, and after the railroad, I guess, and to help Palmer get elected, even though my dad was a Republican. Of course, Palmer was an ardent Democrat. So, but anyway, they got along well, and we had a great time practicing law together, the family, and we kind of each specialized. My brother Charles was what we call a rainmaker, and he was great at getting clients, new clients, and keeping important former or the present clients that my dad had. Both of us split up. Dad represented the borough of Stroudsburg solicitor, and East Stroudsburg, excuse me, and also the East Stroudsburg Borough School District. They had borough school districts, and when East Stroudsburg didn't have way before the jointures happened. And so Chud took the borough and I took the school district in the 50s. And I was a school solicitor for the East Stroudsburg for 32 years, I think it was. Simultaneously, then Pocono Mountain was being forced into the